My family is a first-generation immigrant family. We are ethnically Hmong. When we moved to America, I was the only child. However, over the years, my other siblings were born. And for a while, my paternal grandparents lived with us. If you have a family similar to mine, you will understand that it comes with its perks and its drawbacks. One big drawback was that because we were so poor, we grew up in a very cramped house. The house, as I remember it, was a small 3-bedroom, 2-story house that was built sometime in the early 1920s. My parents slept in one bedroom, my grandparents slept in the second bedroom, and us kids slept in the third bedroom. Often, my baby sister was passed between my parents and grandparents. It was an old house with wooden floors that creaked everywhere. You can forget about privacy and quiet time. Yet, looking back now through the perspective of adulthood, it really wasn't so bad. Our family was a very close and loving family. And because my grandparents lived with us, despite our cramped conditions, our house became the gathering place for my aunts and uncles and their children. We regularly had impromptu dinner parties. Cousins often crashed on the floral print couch in the small living room or on the rough beige carpet that the couch sat upon. And often the weekends became an extension of the dinner parties from Friday night. My mother had a reputation for being an impatient woman, yet somehow she was able to bear with everything, including all of the unplanned gatherings that would often occur. They occurred so much that they just became expected. As you might expect, my grandparents were the patriarch and matriarch of the entire extended family. For this reason and many others, their respective deaths and the days after stood out so vividly in my mind, even as I share this story with you. When my grandfather fell ill, I was only 9 years old. I was still a child, yet I was old enough to remember his face and his voice. I remember the moments of tenderness when he played with me and told me stories about places that I'd never seen and about times that I would never know. Ever since I could remember, grandfather was a smoker. He did not smoke cigarettes per se, but he did like it when people brought him cigarettes. Once I was old enough to be trusted with money, particularly $5 and $10 bills, grandfather would send me down to the corner convenience store. I must have been 7 or 8 years old at most when I began doing this for him. I know it sounds funny now, but in the 1980s, it was just a completely different time. I'd walk down to the store with my crumpled up $5 bill in hand, and in my shy and quiet voice, I'd ask the clerk for a pack of Marlboro cigarettes, a package of gum, and sometimes a few pieces of taffy. And of course, the clerk sold all of that to me, without any questions. I skipped back home with a thumb-sized glob of bubble gum in my mouth, and I'd rush upstairs. I proudly handed the cigarettes and the change to my grandfather. Often, I'd sit with him. He would carefully break open a cigarette. I remembered that I would hold my breath, not wanting to sneeze an entire cigarette's worth of tobacco out of his hand. He would carefully gather up every fiber of tobacco, and then he would very gently pack it into his well-used pipe, and soon the entire room was filled with hazy cigarette smoke. Sometimes my grandmother would complain. She never really complained about the fact that he was smoking. She complained about the smell and the smoke that was left in the room. As a result, she would kick him out and force him to go outside, or force him to go down into the basement to get his smoke. As far as I know, grandfather smoked for years, even before I was born. The lung cancer spread pretty quickly. My father took grandfather to the hospital one day. They were gone all day, then returned in the evening. No one explained anything to me since I was just a child, but I knew something wasn't quite right. I continued to buy cigarettes for grandfather like usual, but now, when he smoked his trusty pipe, my grandmother would scold him fiercely. I didn't really understand why. All of these years, he smoked to his heart's content, Now it was a problem. I remember siding with grandfather, thinking how unfair grandmother was being. Then one day, my father took my grandfather to the hospital again. When we came home from school that day, they still hadn't returned. Night came, and we went to bed as was expected of children. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of many voices filling our small house. I heard the back door open. Then I heard a voice call out my father's name. He was alone. Suddenly, I heard the loudest and most painfully sad wails I would ever hear in my life rush up that stairwell. The emotions of that moment nearly knocked me off my feet. I knew that grandfather was dead. After he died, I hated going into that bedroom. I would often walk by on my way to the bathroom, and I remember that I was never afraid, yet it was a strange thing. Every once in a while when I walked by that bedroom, I could smell fresh cigarette smoke. All of the adults were an emotional wreck, as you can imagine. But it was especially difficult on grandmother. Despite the gruff way that she spoke to grandfather, they had been married for over 50 years. They had loved each other dearly, and now she was struggling, to say the least. For months after his death, she wept for hours on end. Sometimes she would just lay in bed. Sometimes she would sit quietly with grandfather's pipe on her lap as she stared out into nothing. Other family members visited. They would take grandmother out of the house. They took her on getaways and many vacations, but it seemed that there was no cheering her up. Things began to take a creepy turn. One day, while quietly working on homework, grandmother was sitting by the window. She was staring outside, as was her usual habit now. She was humming, then mumbling incoherently. Somewhere in the gibberish, I was able to make out, "He'll come back for me soon. They say that. They say he'll come back for me soon." The goosebumps are raised on my arms now, even as I write those sentences. It was the first time I had ever heard her say something like that. But soon, it would not be the last time. It seemed as if the loss of grandfather had broken her mind. She began talking about the children who waited for her. My father tried to ask her about the children once. She said they were small and black, with long hair and bright red eyes. My father asked her if she meant the children were black kids, since we had African American families that lived in the neighborhood. "No," she replied. She explained that they were not brown. Rather, they were black, like shadows. As you could imagine, I no longer wanted to be in the same room with my grandmother. During the daytime, she was okay for the most part, even though she mumbled a lot to herself. But at night, she could often be heard having full conversations within her bedroom. Dad would knock on the door and ask her who she was talking to. But when he opened the door, grandmother was alone. Sometimes she would wander around the house. My father would go looking for her. If she wasn't in her room or outside, usually he would find her in the basement. My father and his brothers did everything they could think of to help their mother. They brought a shaman over to do a cleansing, which did not work. They took her to see a medical doctor. Physically, she was fine. Traditional medicines and spiritual healings failed to have any effect. My father even invited a pastor over to pray for my grandmother, but things did not get any better. She continued her strange, creepy behavior. She continued to talk to things no one else could see, and she lost weight at an alarming rate. One morning, grandmother did not come down out of her bedroom as usual for breakfast. My mother found her still in bed. She had died in the night. Her body was already cold to the touch, and in her right hand was my grandfather's tobacco pipe. That night, all of my father's siblings and their children gathered at our house. The adults needed to make funeral arrangements. Although the mood was somber, children will be children, and we were sent downstairs to play in the basement. Our basement was not small, but also wasn't very big. and it certainly was not creepy by any means. There were a couple of small rooms located down there. The washer and the dryer were located down there. It became the storage place. Boxes of junk were stacked up. There was an old couch down there. But the big reason why it was not a creepy part of the house is that it was well lit. The lights in the basement had two sets. If you turned both sets on with the light switch, it was really bright. And if you only turned on one set, it was still somewhat bright. My oldest cousin liked to turn on a floor lamp in the corner. Then she had us turn off the overhead lights. The lamp lighting was dim, but just bright enough to cast several long shadows. This created the perfect space for several kids to play hide-and-go-seek. We kids had played this game dozens, if not hundreds of times down there with no issues. The sadness of grandmother's death subsided into the depths of our little minds as we tried to play and have fun like kids usually do. After a couple rounds, something odd happened. One of my younger cousins was hiding in one of the makeshift small rooms. After he had been found, he stood up to exit the room. As he was leaving, he felt someone grab his arm. For a second, he thought another kid was walking out behind him. Then almost immediately, he processed that he was the only one in the room. He shrieked and ran towards the rest of us. He was hyperventilating and on the verge of crying. He said something grabbed his arm. After a quick head count, everyone was accounted for. We all thought he had made a mistake, and nothing had happened. He went and sat on the stairs quietly, but we went back to playing our game. We were kids, and we just shrugged off the incident thinking he had made a mistake. We played several more rounds of hide-and-go-seek without any incident. I had definitely forgotten about the earlier incident. This time, as the seeker began to count, we all scattered. I dashed straight for the small room. I knew that room. I had been in that room many times. My mother kept spare blankets and pillows in there for guests. I often went into that room with my brother to gather those items when people slept over. In the dim light, I ran into that room without thinking. I went into the far back corner, and I hid behind a garbage bag stuffed full of a comforter. I sat still, trying not to breathe. Suddenly, I felt like I was not alone. I felt like there were eyes on me. The screaming and the laughing of my cousins and siblings suddenly became very dull. I tried to focus my eyes, and right there, I could see it. She was no more than 7 or 8 feet away from me in the opposite corner. It was my grandmother. She was squatted down. She was holding her knees to her chest. Her blank face was just looking straight ahead. And suddenly, that face turned slowly towards me, and she smiled. I was frozen in fear. I started to scream, but no matter how hard I tried, no air would come out of my throat. At that moment, another cousin who was the seeker appeared at the door. He loudly rushed inside. The noise he made broke my trance. I was able to look away from my grandmother and at him. I felt blood flow through my body again. It was like a dam breaking. In that moment, I screamed and I burst into tears. I darted out of the dark corner, which scared my cousin and caused him to reverse and run with me. We gathered at the stairs and I just bawled. I was too afraid to say anything. I was able to stammer out that there was something in that room. That little bit of information was enough to scare everyone else into scrambling up the stairs in fear. Upstairs, the adults were still talking. My mother noticed that all of us suddenly came up at once, and I was the only one crying. This was an unusual thing since I was a kid who rarely ever cried. My mother thought that maybe I fell and hurt myself. After she calmed me down, I told her that I saw grandmother in the basement. Several aunts were standing behind her, and I can tell you, every eye turned to me. I wanted to pull a blanket over my head. I was a shy, quiet kid who hated attention. I think for most American families, if a kid told their parents that he had just seen his dead grandma in the basement, they would think he was crazy. For me, my mother believed me. After she told my father, he believed me too. In fact, he pulled his brothers aside and told them what happened. After the night ended, several of the adults went down into the basement together. I wasn't quite sure what they did down there. Years later, my mother tried to explain to me that the oldest uncle tried to reason with grandmother and asked her to behave herself while they made her funeral arrangements. A short time after this, we had my grandmother's funeral. I was there, but I never left my mother or my father's side. Nothing creepy occurred at the funeral, or even afterwards for that matter. We lived in that house for another 2 months after my grandmother's funeral. My father sold the house, and we moved to a pleasantly boring, slightly larger house in a nicer suburb. That was the last paranormal experience that I ever had, and it was enough to last a lifetime. That face in the dark is still seared into my memory, and even now, as a middle-aged man, I sleep with the light on.